Hello, Natroners, and welcome back to another episode of VFX with Natron. So, today we're going to be looking at re-examining motion blur using, well, TimeBlur, which we really didn't go into except for in the last episode, and FrameBlend, which is what we had been telling people to use prior to that. And I also said it at the end of the last episode. I was like very frustrated with Natron because I was getting different results than I had expected based off of previous tests. Which got me wondering, why did my other tests come up different, which is why we're re-examining it. And we're not going to actually render the stuff out inside of Natron because the tests I did were incredibly long and very time consuming. But I want to go over the results of these tests and discuss them with you, and then go over situations because things were not as obvious, and I'll show you why. Actually, we'll just pop over into looking at the files right now. We're just going to look at some photos at first. So this is the first one. This is actually a TimeBlur node. We can see that that in Natron, I had the TimeBlur connected up. Basically, what I did is I took our project that we had worked on last time, or something very similar, and I'd set it up two branches of the exact same thing, going from the text node down to two transform nodes that were offset. I had the slit scan here with a retime, and then a TimeBlur, and then a second branch with the FrameBlend, a slit scan, and then a retime, so that we can do them in both ways. They basically have to be set up identical to get the same result for slit scan, which is why it really doesn't matter which one you use. You have to set up slit scan the same way and retime it down in order to get all 180 frames and get it to match. But where this might affect us, and just so you know, the reason that I was pushing towards FrameBlend is because my original tests, as you'll see, let's talk about them. Let's focus on this. So, right now, this is a TimeBlur. As we can see, if we look at the time, this was looking at the render statistics. I had cleared the cache, and then I had connected. I had first left the viewer node disconnected, and then I connected it up with the cache cleared, and I had reset the render statistics and just let it go at this resolution. All right, so I had the view set to this size, and I let it render, and at a full 1080, okay, so that it had a 1080, basically. I wanted 1080 frames of or slit scan lines, and then I wanted it to do motion blur on top of that. So we're talking a long time per frame, and this is only a single frame, mind you. And as we can see, it took 20 minutes to render this out using the TimeBlur node, all right? Which seems that's a long time. And so this is how I'd been testing it. I had tested it out this way. So then I did the exact same test. So we're going to go forward. We're just going to go forward to the next, which is doing the exact same thing. I cleared the cache, and I reset this time node, and then I connected it up to the FrameBlend. And as we can see, instead of being 20 minutes, we wound up with 4 minutes. That is massive difference in time. That's 5 times faster than the other method. So, and winds up with a technically better blur. And I'll show you why in a few minutes, because we're going to actually look at the settings. Unfortunately, it's covered up here. So I said to myself, okay, that's huge. That's 5 times faster with using FrameBlend, which is why I had been pushing for FrameBlend, or told people use FrameBlend over motion blur. But I wasn't positive that I got a perfect thing. I wanted to make sure. I repeated this multiple times. So we went ahead and redid the test a second time, and now we can see I wanted to show the two things. I have the TimeBlur up here, and I have the FrameBlend down here. I'm connected to the FrameBlend again. We see I got the exact same time, 20 minutes, going to the TimeBlur, excuse me. And we can see that the TimeBlur was set to 10 divisions, all right? And so that meant that the motion blur was basically made up of 10 segments between of the entire thing. whereas the FrameBlend is set to 27. So there would have been 27 steps, the potential for 27 steps. I don't think we really needed it, but in order to do it, the only way to do it with a FrameBlend is you either have to divide your entire the time segments in half, which happens to be in the case of doing 1080, given the divisions and everything. I think we figured out that it was it would have been like, I think it was 54 frames or some 57, I don't know, it was 50 something frames. So that ended up being actually I think it was 56 frames. All right. Anyway, anyway, so the point is that we had to you had to divide it in half and you put it in. So you had to get the midpoint. You either had to do 27 frames, which is the halfway point, which I'm again not good at math off the top of my head. I'd have to sit down and really think. But the key thing is I either had to do the 27 frames, or what we would have had to do is set some offset and do a frame interval. And I'm going to get into that when I do some later tests, because that was another thing I wanted to compare. I wanted to see, okay, if these two started getting close to one another, would that change anything? So right now we're looking at this again. This is the render size we have. We're looking at TimeBlur again, 20 minutes, which makes, when we go to do the other again, clearing everything, we get back and we see again 4 minutes. So that's 2 times. We see that the advantage is going to the FrameBlend. And so I did most of my testing this way, assuming that everything was going to work honky-dory, exactly the same. And then I did it one more time just to be sure, and we can see this time when I did the retime node, or did the FrameBlend node, I decided I wanted to retry it and clear, because I was like, I just want to make sure that, you know, switching nodes isn't changing things. And this time I got 3 minutes, and I was like, okay, that's really weird. This is not, you know, I even got a faster time. So we're talking 6 times faster than the other, which was again 20 minutes. And by the way, I'm just hitting the keyboard shortcut to advance our frames. So we're looking, this is the TimeBlur at 20 minutes, and this is the FrameBlend at 3. So that was just my third test. And so we're seeing, you know, we were talking 5 to 6 times faster when this was rendering out at this size. So it's looking, there's a huge advantage, as you could see, and which is why I was pushing people saying you should really use it, until I started doing the tests last week, where we shrunk everything down so that it was and looked at it at 100%, and we're looking at it at 640 by 480, and suddenly I was getting, you know, TimeBlur was looking better than FrameBlend. So I started to wonder to myself, okay, perhaps the problem is that Natron, when it was rendering at this size, because it does sometimes take shortcuts when it renders at this size, when the screen is shrunk. But I kept thinking to myself, I don't know if it would in this situation, because we're telling it to do hundreds of frames, you know, we're telling it to do this lit scan to do all those frames. And I would think that it would have anti-aliased it and done all this other stuff. But just to be on the safe side, I decided, you know what? I better redo these tests. But what I wanted to do was I wanted to scale it up so that I was looking at the viewer, or the output of the viewer, at full size, which I know was probably going to impact the overall render time a little bit. Oh, little did I know how long it was going to be. But I also wanted to ensure, because even on my display with the Natron interface showing, I wanted to render it. And if you check this button right up here at the top, it forces, we can't see it in this, but here, let me pull up Natron for a minute. So here we go. If we scroll over that button right here, you could say, when checked, the viewer will render the image in its entirety and not just a visible portion. All right. What that means is basically, instead of rendering just what we see in the viewer, what it will do is it will render everything. So if you have this set to, if we had this set to 100% scale, it would render everything at 100%. All right. So I'm going to just minimize that so we get back to this. So I did that test. And so this was, we can see, was doing the TimeBlur. And as we can see, when I did the TimeBlur, you can see I had that checked. I paused it at the end, by the way. This one was actually one that I thought might have been... Was this the one? I thought I did one that I might have made a mistake on, but anyway, I got worried towards the end of this one that there was a mistake made, so I wasn't positive I wanted to keep this, so I redid it, and we'll see it in a minute. But anyway, at an hour, this one came out to an hour and 31 minutes, all right? And that was using the exact same settings, all right? So then I went over and I did it on using the FrameBlend, and lo and behold, we see something totally different, which is suddenly FrameBlend is taking longer to render than before, which means that FrameBlend, and you can see that these results are very, very similar. The only difference really that we're seeing here is regarding the framing of this is mainly because when I trimmed the view to fit, I didn't do a perfect match on it. But you can see that the blurs look near identical as far as the result when they're set up properly. So there's really no advantage to rendering with one over the other, but we are seeing that at this point, now remember, this FrameBlend is using 27 samples versus 10. So that gives a huge, that means that this is getting over twice as many samples for about, what was it? About, we're getting about just about 18 minutes of additional time. Now, that's not horrible, but it's not really a great comparison. So then I think I redid it. I just want to go back. Yes, I redid the other one, and lo and behold, I got, instead of an hour and 31 minutes, I got an hour and 28 minutes. So we can see that the TimeBlur node did get about the same. When I redid it, it got approximately the same time. We're talking a 2-minute time frame, and I was doing other things with my computer at the time. So, those things, I started realizing that when I wanted to do these tests, I needed to be a little more thorough. And we're going to see that because I actually had a Zoom conference with somebody and on one of these, and boy, did that change the alter the time. So we're going to probably disregard that. I think that is in here. We'll see it. This one. Yes, this was during a Zoom conference. So I did a Zoom conference, and lo and behold, this one, when I did the FrameBlend, we can see that it went up to 2 hours and 29 minutes. But I was also trying something else at this point. I wanted to know, okay, did adding or changing it so that or let me go into bring up Natron again right here. If we bring up Natron and we look at the FrameBlend, FrameBlend has this interval here. Now, admittedly, this is not the project I was rendering from. This is our previous episode's project. And we have it set to full, but when I was dealing with 27 frames, one of the things I was wondering is if I dropped it down, in order to get this closer to 10 frames, the only way I could get it to 10 frames is to change this interval from 1 to 2, which would bring it from basically rendering rendering 10 frames to rendering 12 excuse me, instead of rendering 10, it would render about 12 or 13 frames for the actual blur, as opposed to 27. So I thought maybe by increasing the interval, basically it'll skip frames, and I didn't want to skip too many, but I just upped it to 2 just to see if that would speed it up, and lo and behold, what did I get? I ended up getting a longer render time. And so I thought, that actually increased the time. But then I realized later that it wasn't actually that. It was because I had been doing a Zoom call at the time. And so I redid the FrameBlend, and we can see I got an hour and 50 minutes when I did it the second time. So it was a little bit longer than the first time I had done it, but it didn't really save us any time. So then I decided to do one more test of the other one, and again the FrameBlur came out to an hour and 24 minutes this time. So we're seeing that the frame blur is actually, or I should say not frame blur, the time blur is actually when we do it with the 10 frames, it was actually coming up with better times. So then I thought to myself, well, what happens if we give them the equivalent time frame? So I upped it, and lo and behold, I this one was a mistake. This one, I forget what I did here. This one came out wrong. I think this was, I forgot to clear the cache, and I want to make sure. Right. Right. So on this last one, what I did is I upped it so that it matched 27 frames to 27 frames, so that I could see how long it took if you did a full 27 frames using the TimeBlur node instead of the FrameBlur or the FrameBlend. And so if you want to do a full 27 frames, it's actually faster to use the FrameBlend than it is to use the TimeBlur, because we wind up with 2 hours and 1 minute. And this, by the way, was not with anything rendering in the background. And so we have a better idea. So it actually came out faster using the FrameBlend when you're doing a full 27 frames of motion blur, if you wanted to do it. Now, admittedly, this is using slit scan with no line skipping whatsoever, doing a full 1080 thing. I don't ever recommend this, because this is super duper. You're going to wait, to render out this whole thing. I would not do it the way I did it in this, which is what I would do is I would render out the frames as an entire image sequence, and then do your slit scan on top of that, because otherwise you're going to, the problem is that it has to figure out all the calculations and do the math per frame. And I think it might be faster. I have not tested this fully, but I wanted to bring that up because it also means that we need to re-look at another episode that we did, where we were actually talking about motion blur. And in particular, this episode here, where we were talking about the motion blur, and I had talked about using FrameBlend for this, and stretching out the time, and doing all this extra gobbledygook to give us the option to get a nice FrameBlend, because I was under the impression that FrameBlend rendered faster, significantly faster. But now that we know that FrameBlend does not actually render faster if we do an even 10 frames, which is what we were doing in this case. We were scaling, unlike the slit scan, where the time that we stretched it out was completely based off of the animation. We wanted one line per, or however many lines per slits we wanted per on our frame. So we had 1080 obviously meant we had massive amounts. So the advantage in that situation was going to lead towards the FrameBlend. I mean, not the FrameBlend, towards the TimeBlur. The TimeBlur node worked better in that situation. But in this situation, it's going to be a little more, as we saw, the TimeBlur actually got a slight slower result than the FrameBlend method. But there's more in this situation. There's pros and cons to it. We have to weigh, is the additional, when we're doing roto animation, what we have to do to get the roto animation to blur with the FrameBlend is we had to stretch out the animation, as you remember. And the question is if the time difference, if the time savings using a FrameBlend was 5 times faster, then yeah, I think that stretching it out in time is worth it. But what we were seeing at the end was, FrameBlend was only about when they were doing the exact same frame count, FrameBlend was only about, it was a little bit faster. It was less than one, it was like TimeBlur was like maybe a 10th slower than it, not 5 times slower. So to me, that means that we need to readdress this. So if somebody wants to do a motion blur, there's also another thing, which is or TimeBlur does not suffer from needing to stretch it out in this case. So what do I mean by that? All right, so here on our right, let's reset our FrameBlend. Right now, the FrameBlend, what we did is we had set the FrameBlend to do that fun. I said I like the way this looks, and there are people because it made the motion blur on the hand, which is right, because this is not right. This is set to loop. Right. Wait a minute, why wasn't that looping? That's weird. All right, well, anyway, this was set to loop, and we could see that the reason that I thought that this type of blur might be useful for people is because it makes the hand not look, or the blur for the hand, it reads better than without motion blur. But the problem is, the problem I had when we went to, when we did the motion blur, or when we set up the frame blend, so that we turn the decay to 0, which does an actual, an actual motion blur. So that this is actually, right now, what we're looking at is we're looking at the frame blend with a true 180 degree. I think this is 180 degree. Did we set this? This might be here. We'll test it out, because what we're going to do over here is on the other side, we're going to put in a time blur. So the reason this is important here is, yeah, we've got longer than 180 degree. We get closer to 200. All right. So, well, this isn't going to be, all right, this isn't a real fair comparison. But we can see that with the using the frame blend this way, where we stretched it out, actually, I think all we need to do is do 10. Let's just set it, there we go. That should be, and it's looking, well, anyway, we can see here that both are looking very similar. We wind up with a very similar, this is true motion blur over here using the time blur, and this is using the frame blend. Now, given the, yes, still setting the time blur to do 10 frames versus the frame blend doing the 10 frames, we see that the frame blend will render slightly faster, because we've done the test in the past. It's not going to be much faster in this situation, because we're not doing lots and lots and lots of frames. But it's probably going to be like, maybe the whole thing would render maybe maybe a minute faster at the most if we did a longer animation, which to me, that doesn't seem like much of an advantage when you have to stretch out the time. Whereas the time blur, if we did the time blur will, we can see, we'll render these both out. Let's watch how fast. These are going to render pretty darn close. We're looking at this here. We're looking at this only at 44% of its size, but we can see that the time blur is actually resulting in a better actual overall, or potentially better overall animation. If we look at it, I actually am not positive now that we're looking at it. There are a couple things. At the beginning, on the very first frame for the time blur, when we get to the loop frames, it may not loop as cleanly. Let's look at these. Just right here. Yes, we can see this is the one advantage to using the time loop, is that or using the frame blend, is that we wind up with an extra frame here for the loop when it's gotten back to the beginning. We can see that, oh, well, actually, we just wind up with an extra frame. That's all. Actually, that might indicate that it's just off by a frame. But whatever. It doesn't matter. The point is that we wind up with basically the same. We wind up with something that's more or less reads very similar, with a little bit more of a pause on the other one. Anyway, this is basically a short episode, because it's important that people know this is, I consider motion blur to be such an important thing for people to want and desire in their animations, that it's important to understand which way is going to give us the most efficient motion blur. And at this point, I would say, because it's such a minimal thing and it requires so much less effort to use time blur now that I understand that the problem isn't or isn't, it's not as exponential a difference as I had originally thought, I would lean people or tell people to use TimeBlur over FrameBlend most of the time, unless they want to try and get away from looking like 180 degree motion blur, where over like here we get these straight lines, because it's actually, the things are moving in, it's not moving in a true arc, we're moving in, the points are moving in a linear motion, because otherwise we'd have to keyframe every frame, and it just wasn't worth it for this case. So that's why I liked the other thing where we had taken the frame interval, or not the frame interval, the decay up to 0.2, which made it look a lot more like it was trailing, and gave us a nice looking, oops, no, 30, we wanted 20. It gave us a nicer looking motion. It kind of gave an archy feeling to the motion, so that the fingers didn't look like they were sort of squared off, whereas here they just look like lines going across. Whereas here it gives more of a rounded smoothness, which we talked about in the previous one. So I think that pretty much covers it. There is a couple things I did also want to point out, which are some advantages that one might find if they do decide to go with FrameBlend, which we really didn't, I don't know that I talked about, which is we're also not restricted with FrameBlend to doing an average, which results in this. FrameBlend also opens up a couple other types of motion or types of blurring options that we can use. I don't remember if I mentioned these, but let's go back to this, and let's set it back to 10 so we can see it side by side, and switch this between, we can set this to maximum, and we can see that, or excuse me, minimum. So we can see that by setting this to minimum, we can change, we can change how by changing the operator, operation, we can change what it does and potentially get a more interesting kind of motion blur, or an interesting way. For example, here, instead of getting motion blur for if you're doing 2D cartoons, here's something using Max. What we could do here, if we look at this, we can get squash and stretch using this method instead. So now the FrameBlend gives us squash and stretch versus the TimeBlur, which will only give us a motion blur. So that if you want to do squash and stretch, there's automatic squash and stretch using Max. But it only works if we were doing black and white. We could do some, which also, I think a couple of these, if we drop the count down a smidge, nope, we'll just keep it there. Some, what was it, product, one of these, I thought gave me, I'm not seeing it here. But anyway, you can also mix this down, which is another thing. So you can by mixing it down, we can cause these to blend and get more interesting results. So we'll take it and look at the minimum. There we go. We get some interesting ghosting, and then maximum. The maximum is the one where, maximum. Then we go to some. Yeah, some can get a really interesting, almost. Here's a different type of blur that we could do that's very similar to some. If we bring it down to 0.1, because we're doing 10 frames, we again wind up with an almost a frame-to-frame blur that looks more like what we were getting when we adjusted the decay. But again, we can adjust the decay and alter that even more. So there's a lot more options. So if you want to try and get something that looks more unique, the FrameBlend node is also better for that type of thing. Again, I think the biggest thing would be if you want to get something that had more squash and stretchy type of motion. It's not really going to be squash and stretch, however, because you're not really, we are getting stretch, but we're not really getting squash in this situation, at least. Actually, you know what? We could try that here. Let's pop over to our ball, because we have the balls here. If we change this one over to just maximum, go, where was that? Is this Do we still have the animation on this? There we go. Let's, wait a minute. Oh no, that was back here. All right, there we go. You can see this would give us something that's more squashy, stretchy type motion. So we can see the bottom is using max to do almost a squash and stretch type thing. The big problem is it's aliased because it's doing the maximum, but you could blend it down, or you could try some other things and come out with something, or you could put an aliasing node or blur it or something along those lines. Or you could put an outline on around it, because if you're doing squash and stretch, you might want to have it, but that might be useful. So there we go. We can see that works pretty well for a more cartoony look. Anyway, so again, this is a really short episode because we're revisiting it. I just wanted to share my results. It took a long time. I spent probably 3 or 4 days working on this, or getting this, and also working on, and for people who also have been following along on the particle thing. I figured out where there's a problem with the particles. We're going to go into that. That will be next week. We're going to have to readdress some things and talk about it, and we'll get into that next episode. Actually, probably going to skip particles because I'm hoping that somebody might fix something. Anyhow, so I think that's it. Thanks for watching. Keep on Natroning.